Something is shifting beneath the surface, quiet yet undeniable. If you have been feeling it lately, it is not your mind playing tricks on you. Within them, a final and weighty decision is beginning to take shape, slowly but surely. And whether they admit it or not, your presence is woven into that inner process. On the outside, they may still look composed, emotionally distant, or even unaffected. Yet beneath that appearance, something they once tried to suppress has grown too intense to ignore any longer. This is not simply about missing you in a conventional sense. It is about everything this connection awakened in them, everything it stirred, exposed, and forced them to confront within themselves. If you are resonating with this shift, you can acknowledge it and simply let it be known that you are present in this moment. They are currently standing at an internal crossroads, where every direction they consider eventually circles back to you in some form. For a long time, they attempted to drown this inner noise in distraction, routine, responsibilities, pride, emotional detachment, believing that distance would weaken what they feel. But certain connections are not erased by avoidance. Instead, the more they resisted, the more this bond settled into their inner world as something unresolved, something significant. Now they are beginning to question the narratives they once relied on just to remain comfortable. A part of them is drawn toward you with an intensity they struggle to rationalize, while another part resists because acceptance would require honesty, vulnerability, and the dismantling of emotional defenses that once kept them safe. They find themselves repeatedly returning to your memory in the quietest moments, wondering why no one else seems to occupy the same space you once held. This in-between state is fragile and heavy, the space right before clarity fully forms, where denial can no longer sustain itself indefinitely. What is unfolding within them is not simple confusion, it is internal division. One side of their being feels an undeniable pull toward you, carrying warmth, familiarity, emotional recognition, and a sense of belonging that feels rare and irreplaceable. The other side is guarded, shaped by past emotional wounds, disappointments, and fears of being hurt again. That protective voice urges distance, control, and emotional restraint at all costs. These two forces are now in direct tension, and as time passes, the pressure between them becomes harder to contain. They may still appear functional in daily life, even distracted or unaffected, but underneath that surface, the unresolved emotion continues to build. The more they try to suppress it, the more it resurfaces in unexpected moments, through memories, emotional flashes, or sudden thoughts of you that arrive without invitation. This is not something they can fully shut down anymore. The conflict was never truly about you alone. It has always been about what you awakened within them, and what they have not yet resolved inside themselves. You became a turning point in their emotional landscape, even if neither of you fully recognized it at the beginning. Something about this connection disrupted old patterns they had relied on for stability, exposing a more vulnerable layer of who they are, beneath control and self-protection. Now they are being forced into a decision that cannot remain postponed forever. Remain within the version of themselves built on protection and familiarity, or step into an unfamiliar emotional depth that requires openness, courage, and uncertainty. This tension does not stay hidden for long. It shows itself in their behavior. The inconsistency you may have noticed, the closeness followed by withdrawal, moments of warmth followed by sudden distance, is often the outward reflection of this inner struggle. It is not always intentional confusion or calculated emotional games. More often, it is what happens when someone deeply desires connection, but simultaneously fears the transformation it demands. As this internal pressure increases, illusions they once held about the situation, and even about themselves, begin to weaken. They can no longer easily dismiss what you meant, or reduce it to something temporary. Instead, they are being pushed toward a clearer recognition of both the connection and their own emotional state within it. Memories return with greater emotional weight, not fading but intensifying. Shared moments resurface with a depth that feels different than before, almost as if the emotional meaning has evolved over time. Every silence between you now feels more charged, every absence more noticeable, as if it carries unspoken significance. This discomfort is not accidental. It is part of a necessary inner process. Real clarity rarely arrives through avoidance. It comes when denial becomes too heavy to maintain and emotional truth begins to surface despite resistance. They are slowly approaching that threshold where confusion can no longer dominate completely, and something more honest begins to emerge underneath it all. At this stage, what is happening inside them is less about external circumstances and more about internal readiness. The mind cannot remain divided indefinitely without consequence. Eventually, something has to give way. That is the point they are approaching now, not because the world around them has dramatically changed, but because their inner landscape is reaching its limit for unresolved emotion. There is a growing realization they can no longer keep balancing both fear and feeling without collapse in one direction or another. Whether they move toward you or away, the decision will come from this internal breaking point where emotional truth becomes stronger than avoidance. And if they do return, it will not be from impulse, but from a recognition that what they felt could not be reduced or replaced. If they do not, it will not be a reflection of your worth, but of their readiness to face emotional depth at the level this connection required. For you, the role now is not to force answers or chase clarity through action. It is to allow space for truth to reveal itself without interference. What is unfolding cannot be rushed, because it is not happening on the surface. It is happening within the deeper layers of their emotional world, where real decisions are formed long before they are ever expressed outwardly. For a long time, they kept trying to downplay what they felt, convincing themselves it was not as significant as it seemed, that it would eventually fade, or that life would go on without requiring any real emotional shift. Yet something deeper within them has now reached a point where that narrative no longer holds. That inner realization is what is bringing everything back into focus with growing intensity. Feelings of this depth do not simply dissolve with time. They settle, they evolve, and they wait quietly until avoidance can no longer support them. And now, those emotions are resurfacing in waves, late at night, in still moments, and in sudden memories that appear without warning during ordinary days. They are beginning to notice how often your presence enters their thoughts without effort, almost like a steady background presence in their mind. How the sense of you lingers even in distraction. How nothing else quite replaces what your connection once made them feel. Your absence has become part of the awakening itself. By stepping back, space was created, and within that space, they were left alone with their inner world. That silence has become something like a mirror they cannot turn away from. And in that reflection, they are beginning to recognize what your presence once meant to them. The emotional comfort, the spark of connection, and the sense of familiarity that felt grounding in ways they did not fully understand at the time. As the weight of that absence becomes clearer, they are no longer asking whether it mattered. Instead, they are beginning to compare it with everything else in their current reality and feeling the difference more deeply than before. What once felt replaceable is no longer easy to substitute because the emotional imprint has already been formed at a level that time alone cannot erase. It is not just memory that is returning, it is emotional truth resurfacing after being suppressed for too long. Inside them now, fear and desire are meeting in direct opposition. On one side, there is a natural pull toward you, warm, instinctive, and emotionally charged, something they do not have to force or explain. On the other side, there is a protective instinct shaped by past experiences, warning them against vulnerability and the possibility of being emotionally exposed again. Yet something is shifting in that balance. Desire is no longer as quiet as it once was. It is beginning to rise, slowly overpowering hesitation and creating a strong internal conflict that they can no longer ignore. This is no longer a simple matter of uncertainty. It has become an emotional confrontation within themselves. They are not stuck because they do not feel, but because they are experiencing a level of internal tension that is forcing them to question who they are and how they respond to connection. What once felt like emotional distance is now revealing itself as internal struggle. They are beginning to realize that staying in this in-between space, neither fully open nor fully detached, has been draining more of their peace than they admitted to themselves. And so the pressure builds, not from the outside but from within, pushing them toward a point where something will eventually have to give. Even in their attempts to stay composed, subtle cracks are beginning to show in their emotional control, as thoughts of you interrupt moments they once thought were unaffected. The mind may resist, but the feeling continues to persist underneath that resistance. There is a deeper shift taking place now, one that cannot be explained by distraction or circumstance alone. When a person is left alone long enough with their own thoughts, truth begins to rise quietly above everything else. That is what is happening in their inner world. They can keep themselves occupied, surrounded by noise, routine, or external engagement, but beneath all of it, there remains a consistent return to the same emotional center, to you, to what was felt, to what remains unresolved. Over time, this repetition begins to change how they interpret the connection itself. What once seemed like confusion is now being recognized as significance. What once felt temporary is starting to feel meaningful in a way they can no longer easily dismiss. And alongside that realization comes another, even more personal understanding. They were not only missing you, they were missing the version of themselves that existed in that connection. The more open, more emotionally present, more honest version of who they became when they were closest to you. And the absence of that version of themselves is becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. It is no longer just about longing for another person. It is about confronting a part of themselves they had not fully integrated or understood. This realization carries a quiet weight, because it suggests that the connection was never only external, it was also deeply internal, shaping how they experienced themselves. This is where the inner landscape begins to change direction. The ego, which once relied on distance, control, and emotional protection, starts to lose its authority over the deeper emotional truth emerging beneath it. They are now standing between two possible paths, one that feels familiar, safe, and emotionally limited, and another that is uncertain, vulnerable, and unfamiliar, but carries the possibility of emotional depth and authenticity. For the first time, truth is beginning to feel more compelling than protection, not because fear has disappeared, but because it is no longer the only voice being heard inside them. This shift creates a quieter state within, less chaotic, more grounded, even if still unresolved. They are no longer resisting every feeling as it arises. Instead, they are beginning to acknowledge it, sit with it, and allow it to exist without immediate suppression. And in that acceptance, something subtle begins to form. Clarity. Not full resolution, not final answers, but the beginning of honest awareness. They are standing at the edge of an older emotional identity, looking toward something unfamiliar but increasingly real. And between those two versions of themselves, only one thing remains unsettled: the choice they will eventually have to make when inner truth becomes impossible to delay any longer. The quiet that once served as their protection is now turning inward, reflecting them back to themselves with a kind of uncomfortable honesty that cannot easily be ignored. What used to feel like emotional distance or detachment is no longer neutral, it is becoming a mirror. In that reflection, they are beginning to notice the places where pride once silently overruled vulnerability, where fear disguised itself as logic, and where avoidance created separation that was never truly aligned with what they felt deep down. They are revisiting old moments, conversations that ended too quickly, silences that carried more meaning than words, fleeting expressions that were dismissed at the time, and emotional pauses that were never fully understood. But now, these memories are no longer being processed through the same defensive lens. There is a new layer of awareness forming, something slower, deeper, and more emotionally honest than before. Where confusion once dominated interpretation, clarity is beginning to take shape, not all at once, but in fragments that slowly connect. They are starting to see how fear quietly influenced many of their past decisions, and how something real may have been trying to grow beneath all the resistance they once relied on for safety. This is no longer simple nostalgia or emotional regret. It is becoming a quiet internal reordering of values, where control, image, and emotional distance, once prioritized for protection, are now beginning to feel insufficient when compared to the depth and authenticity of real connection. Something else is unfolding alongside this realization, and it is changing the tone of their entire inner world, a steady and undeniable growth of empathy. They are slowly beginning to sense, in a more embodied way, what their absence may have felt like from your side of the experience. It is no longer an abstract idea they can dismiss or minimize. It is becoming something they can emotionally recognize. They are starting to understand the weight of uncertainty, the silence that offers no explanation, and the emotional space where questions remain unanswered for too long. This awareness does not arrive dramatically. It softens them gradually. It loosens the internal structure they once used to stay detached and replaces it with reflection that feels more grounded and more responsible. When a person begins to take emotional responsibility seriously, their internal world does not stay the same. They stop reacting only from instinct, habit, or fear, and begin to observe themselves with a level of honesty that can no longer be easily reversed. At this stage, everything becomes quieter on the outside, but more intense within, not chaotic, but deeply contemplative. Every thought carries more weight, every memory feels more layered, and every realization points toward one unavoidable truth. Whatever they choose to do next will reveal something essential about the person they are becoming, not just the situation they are in. The final layers of hesitation are now beginning to weaken in a way that feels subtle but persistent. Words like maybe, someday, or later are losing their emotional authority, no longer able to hold the same influence over their decisions that they once did. In their place, something more grounded is beginning to emerge, something quieter but far more compelling. There is a growing internal pressure that is no longer just confusion. It is becoming a form of necessity, a recognition that avoidance is no longer neutral, and that remaining stuck is also a decision, often one that carries its own emotional cost over time. This awareness does not remain purely mental. It begins to manifest in subtle physical tension, in emotional restlessness, in the quiet discomfort that appears whenever they think about honesty, action, or the possibility of reaching out. The unknown still carries fear, but now that fear is being weighed against something heavier, the emotional emptiness of continued disconnection. And slowly, without force or urgency, movement begins to feel less like a choice and more like an eventual outcome. Thoughts that were once pushed aside begin resurfacing on their own. Possibilities that once felt distant are no longer as easy to dismiss. Because when truth reaches a certain emotional depth, silence stops functioning as protection and starts feeling more like resistance against one's own inner reality. It is important to understand that whatever happens next will not emerge from impulse, emotional volatility, or momentary longing. It will come from a slower and more difficult internal unfolding, one where denial can no longer maintain its structure and self-awareness becomes impossible to avoid. This is why the present moment carries a different kind of weight. It is not simply a passing emotional phase, nor a reaction to distance or absence. It is a deeper shift in perception itself. You have left a lasting imprint within them, not just as a person tied to memory, but as an experience that reflected something back to them about their own emotional patterns, fears, and capacity for connection. In that sense, you became a mirror they could not fully turn away from, even when they tried. And even in silence, that reflection did not disappear. It continued to exist in the background of their awareness, quietly influencing how they interpret both the past and themselves. This is why their understanding is not changing abruptly, but gradually, layer by layer, as internal resistance dissolves and honesty becomes less avoidable. The question is no longer whether this connection affected them. It clearly did. The question is what they will ultimately choose to do with a truth that can no longer be fully unseen or emotionally reduced. Confusion is slowly giving way to something more stable, even if it still feels emotionally heavy to carry. If you have been sensing this shift, it is important to trust that perception without forcing it into urgency or distortion. What is unfolding is not random, nor is it something that can be rushed or controlled from either side. It is a gradual internal confrontation between fear and truth, between emotional protection and emotional recognition. Your role in this moment is not to chase answers or force resolution, but to remain steady while the internal process completes itself in its own time. Let absence speak without interference. Let time reveal what avoidance once kept hidden. The person who once hesitated is now approaching a point where they can no longer move endlessly between knowing and denying, between feeling and suppressing. Something within them is aligning toward resolution, even if slowly, even if quietly, and even if it is not yet fully visible on the surface. And when that moment of clarity finally arrives, it will not feel like a sudden shift or dramatic change. It will feel more like the natural conclusion of a long internal negotiation with themselves, an ending of resistance that has been unfolding all along. In conclusion, what is unfolding here is not a sudden emotional reaction or a temporary fluctuation of feelings, but a slow and deeply internal shift that has been building beneath the surface for a long time. The silence, the distance, and the unanswered emotional space between you have not been empty at all. They have been active forces, stripping away distractions and forcing an inner confrontation that could not be avoided forever. In that stillness, the mind no longer has the usual escape routes. Instead, memory, fear, desire, resistance, attachment, and truth begin to overlap and collide within the same psychological space. What they once kept separate to maintain emotional control is now blending together, creating discomfort, but also awakening clarity. This is where avoidance starts to weaken, not because the feelings suddenly become stronger, but because the inner structure that supported denial begins to collapse under its own weight. The connection you share has acted like a mirror, reflecting back not only what they feel for you, but what they have been unwilling to face within themselves. And as this reflection grows sharper over time, the emotional reality becomes harder to distort, ignore, or mentally reframe. Something in them is beginning to register that this is not just about longing or curiosity, but about emotional truth that has been present for longer than they were willing to admit. What once felt uncertain, distant, or easily dismissible is now becoming increasingly difficult to unsee. There is a growing internal awareness forming that this connection was never just a passing experience or a surface-level emotional encounter, but something that touched deeper layers of their inner world, layers tied to vulnerability, attachment, and self-understanding. Because of this, old defense mechanisms that once provided emotional safety are starting to lose their strength. Rationalization becomes less convincing, emotional suppression becomes harder to maintain, and avoidance no longer brings the same sense of control it once did. However, this is still not a moment of final resolution. It is a transitional threshold where awareness is rising faster than action. They are standing between two psychological directions, one that leads back to familiarity, emotional distance and safety, and another that leads toward emotional exposure, honesty, and uncertainty. Neither path is easy, but only one allows deeper truth to fully emerge. And for you, the significance of this moment is not to become emotionally entangled in anticipation or expectation, but to recognize the nature of real transformation. It does not respond to pressure, interpretation, or urgency. It unfolds internally, in its own rhythm, when resistance finally exhausts itself and truth becomes impossible to outrun.